Okay, today we're going to talk about sonnets. The ladies love sonnets, am I right? I don't know. Probably. They used to anyway. As for the little comic here, only some of the sonnets we'll look at today will be bawdy, but that's how it goes with all of Shakespeare's works. Little bit of raunch. Why did I say that? Okay, let's move on. To try to make it sound as boring as possible right off the bat, what we now call the sonnet originated in the 13th century in Italy. Not so coincidentally, the European Renaissance began in Italy around this time before spreading to the rest of Europe. What we now call the English Renaissance stemmed from this. The word Renaissance itself means rebirth, and it truly was a time of rebirth, the idea of returning to the classical ways of thinking, classical referring to Greek and Roman, and the way that they explored and examined art and science. After the fall of the Roman Empire comes what we refer to as the Middle Ages, the medieval period. This was a time of religious fervor where devotion was more important than scientific progress, and it was heresy to disagree with the church. That is a very broad brush, but that's what we're using for now, for this class. The Renaissance, then, was a returning to the classical Greek and Roman artistic styles of exploration of the world and of art and literature and philosophy and science. Anyway, to get back on track, the original sonnet came from Francesco Petrarch. Hence, the Petrarchan sonnet was the Italian, and then the English is the Shakespearean. On this slide here, you'll find a few condensed guidelines that we'll delve into further. Pardon. So, Shakespeare has a collection of 154 sonnets, which we will not be reading. As you've seen by checking this week's folder, and hopefully already reading them, I have chosen 5. But let's talk briefly about the characters in the sonnet collection as a whole. The first group of sonnets, 1 to 26, are addressed to a young man. They are sonnets mostly about pure love and adoration and devotion, marred by the subject's occasional failure to live up to the ideal love that the poet envisages for him. Sonnets 1 through 17 in particular are known as the baby-making sonnets, my term, but they are devoted to the idea of convincing this young man to have children and to therefore carry on his line. I think maybe his mom commissioned them. The second group, 127 to 152, describes his love, or perhaps better worded, his infatuation with his dark mistress. And we call her the dark mistress because she is described throughout this sequence using very dark adjectives. The love shown in these poems is tainted and distorted by sexual attraction, and the poet laments the hold that this woman has on him. Eventually it becomes clear that the beloved and the dark mistress are in love with each other, which is obviously problematic for our poor narrator, as this sap loves both of them. We'll touch on the narrator a bit more, but before we move on, let's do a brief overview of our literary terms for the week. Okay, copia, conceit, and volta. An important concept in the sonnet collection is that if you can say something once, you can say it 4 times, each one more beautifully, eloquently, and persuasively than the last. This is then called copia, which is the Latin word for abundance. In early modern English literature, there was a popular trope of repeating and rewording an argument over and over. So many of the sonnets in Shakespeare's collection are reiterations of the same theme. Now, these sonnets are often written to praise a benefactor, so the recurring themes include honoring his beauty, convincing him to have kids, fear of that beauty fading, discussion of ways to keep it from fading, again, with the kids, but also through the narrator's written immortalization. So yeah, 17 sonnets, 1 through 17, arguing the same point, which is that hot people should have kids. This is copia. Our second literary term for the week is conceit. Originally, the term was almost synonymous with the word concept or conception, implying something conceived or created in the mind. Its later application was to a type of poetic metaphor, and its definition now retains that idea of being a fanciful notion, but with the addition of it also being an elaborate analogy pointing to pointing to similarities between two very different things. So we'll look at that as we go forward. Remember, though, it can be a brief metaphor, but it can also be the framework for an entire poem or sonnet. So an entire poem, sonnet, etc. might be dedicated to one conceit. The last term is volta, which again is another Italian word. It comes from the word for to turn. In a sonnet, the volta is the turn of thought or argument. In the Petrarchan, in the Petrarchan or Italian sonnets, it occurs between the octave and the sestet. And in the Shakespearean or the English, it usually occurs before the final couplet, which is the last two rhyming lines. In other words, you think the sonnet's about one thing, and then, bam! It's about something else. Or, less dramatically than that, it just denotes a change in tone. Maybe a therefore, and then the thesis or the conclusion, that kind of thing. Helpfully, these are sometimes marked with but, or and yet, or though, that sort of thing. We'll look at some today. So, keeping these ideas in mind, remember that a sonnet is not only a form of poetry, it's a framework for a way of thinking. Alright, so sonnet theories. You should have gotten to read a little bit about this in the article, Shakespeare's Sexuality and the Sonnets, I think is what it was called. Anyway, so Shakespeare's sonnets were likely composed over an extended period from 1592 to 1598. And that was the year in which Francis Meres referred to Shakespeare's sugared sonnets among private friends. In 1609, Thomas Thorpe published Shakespeare's sonnets, probably without the author's permission, which was touched on. And the sonnets were dedicated to a W.H., whose identity remains a mystery. It's hotly debated, as they covered, whether or not these sonnets were about Shakespeare's life, or if they were all fiction. One note about that is that when you read somebody's criticism, and they pick a side, a lot of times you can kind of see in their criticism what their own motives are. And that's part of what makes Shakespeare such a lasting thing, even to this day, is that he can be used as a vehicle for pushing people's thoughts, opinions, agendas. There are feminists who embrace Shakespeare. There are gay rights activists who embrace Shakespeare. That's one of the great universal things about it. Anyway, not on that tangent. Let's get back to the narrator. The earliest theory, which has the strongest amount of support, just because it does. There are better reasons than because it does, but anyway. It's that they're strictly autobiographical. They tell a story of Shakespeare's life in London through a certain number of years, about a remarkable private friendship with a certain young man of a really high rank, namely that Mr. W.H., a friendship that was complicated by love intrigue and the presence on the scene of another rival poet, which pops up. Anyway, all that jazz. The second theory is that they are wholly fantastic and imaginary, a novel of friendship and love sketched out by Shakespeare and told imperfectly and in a shadowy manner in lyrics supposedly spoken by these fancy people. It would not be his first or his last made-up story, after all. And then, of course, it could be a combination of the two, as was talked about. Is this autobiographical? Absolutely it is, and not at all. Because all authors put themselves into their works, but it's almost impossible to determine how much and in what ways. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Let's stop talking about the sonnets and start actually examining them. We begin with Sonnet 18, which is one of the most famous, if not the most famous sonnet. I recommend pausing here and rewatching the link of the sonnet read by Tom Hiddleston, who loves Shakespeare, by the way. We'll see more of him when we get to Henry IV. He does a great job playing Prince Hal in that BBC adaptation. But anyway, so this is written in iambic pentameter, which means it is 14 lines of stressed, unstressed syllables. You can think of the stressing as a heartbeat. Ba-bum, ba-bum. This meter closely resembles human speech, and that's wonderful and helpful. Here are two examples of regular phrases in iambic pentameter. I take the subway every day to school. I take the subway every day to school. Obviously, you don't say it like I just did, but that's the stress on each of those. Another is, I can't go out because my homework's late. So now we can try it with, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And again, say it like that. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Hopefully, this gives you at least a little idea of the meter and the verse itself. Okay. As you can see from the colored markings here, this is what the rhyme scheme looks like in a Shakespearean sonnet. Line 1 rhymes with line 3, so they are both marked with A. Line 2 rhymes with line 4, so they are marked with B. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Now here you might have noticed that temperate and short a date don't exactly rhyme. But from context, we can get a little clue into the small changes in pronunciation over the years, because obviously they used to rhyme. Most likely it was temperate, which would make sense with the rules of English. So short a date, temperate. So what is this sonnet actually about then? It's very obviously flattering and praising of the subject's beauty, saying that they are even better than a summer's day. You can also see how the sonnet sets up a comparison, or a theme, in the very first lines. Your beauty versus a summer's day. And then it runs with it, compares and contrasts. So, to continue, sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines. Sometimes summer's too hot. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. And other times it's too cloudy. And every fair from fair sometimes declines. And every lovely thing from loveliness declines. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Either by chance or by nature's changing seasons made ordinary. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. And here we can see the volta of the sonnet, where the line of thinking changes. That's why I highlighted it in yellow. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor will you lose the beauty that you own in yourself. In this case, owest means own. Nor shall death brag though wanderest in his shade. Thou. Oh my God, I'm not doing a good job. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, nor can death say that he claimed you or your beauty. When in eternal lines to time thou growest, when in immortal poetry you are planted and grow in time. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. This sonnet comes right after those first 17 about having offspring, so the this in the final line could mean the continuing line of succession, or it could be referencing the poem itself, praising his immortal beauty as a way to record him for all time. Or it could be both. Shakespeare's a big fan of both. Also to note, I have broken up the sonnets here on the screen. Normally there wouldn't be any line breaks, as you saw when you read, but it's easier to examine the quatrains and the couplets as separated. Quatrains refer to the blocks of 4 lines with their rhyme scheme, and then the couplets are the last 2 that rhyme together. All right, Sonnet 104 is a big jump from 18. We just sort of all the way ahead, but I did this because it follows much the same theme. Though at this point the young man does seem to have aged. I mean, he's almost 100 sonnets old at this point, right? So, to me, fair friend, you never can be old, for as you were when first your eye I eyed, when our eyes first met, Such seems your beauty still. 3 winters cold have from the forest shook 3 summers' pride. All right. This sonnet obviously returns to the same metaphor as the one we just saw, the same conceit even. A little bit of copia here, you know, talking about age and the seasons again. But something has changed. 3 beauteous springs to yellow autumn turned, in process of the seasons I have seen. 3 April's perfumes in 3 hot Junes burned, since first I saw you fresh, which yet are green. In case it's not well known, green refers to being young or new in literature, and not to being jealous. But yeah, okay, so the first 2 stanzas focus on describing how time has marched on for 3 years. It could literally mean 3 years, or it could be used as a general term for time passing, a conventional length of time for love to build and fructify, 40 days and 40 nights kind of thing. The number 3 might have been used perhaps based on the significance of the number 3 in the Bible. There are a lot of biblical allusions in Renaissance literature. Could be a number of things, who knows. 3 is also just a good number. But then, past the description of the passage of years, the poet walks back what he says. So he says in the beginning, you could never be old, you look the exact same. Yet doth beauty like a dial hand. So here we have our Volta. Steal from his figure, and no pace perceived. You don't see the hands of the clock move, and yet they do. So he's comparing this to people aging. You don't. Back then, they actually didn't have a minute hand. It was so even less than we would be able to see the hands of a clock moving. They seem still, but you look away and you look back, and an hour has passed. So, again, same with people aging. So your sweet hue, your youthful coloring, which methinks still doth stand, which I claim to have not seen changed, hath motion, and mine eye may be deceived. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you do look older. For fear of which, hear this, thou age unbred. So, fearing this, listen up, generations that have yet to be born. He's literally talking to us right now. Hey, you guys, in the future, reading my sonnets in Introduction to Shakespeare. Okay, maybe not exactly that, but whatever. Ere you were born was beauty's summer dead. The most beautiful creature in the world lived and died before you were born, and you never knew him. It's a bit more of a pessimistic take than the last one, but see how he ties summer back into his metaphor. It's interesting to compare this to Sonnet 18 in terms of tone, so think about that. Sorry, I hope you can't hear that. I'm getting telemarketed. Sonnet 16, here is a great one. And you can go back again if you'd like and listen to the immaculate Patrick Stewart, Sir Patrick Stewart, read this one. You can pause at all of these and go back and listen to those if you so desire. Let not the marriage of true minds admit impediments. So true minds suggests this union is non-physical, platonic, and idealistic, very much in the theme of the first half of the sonnets. And admit impediments. We already know it's about marriage, the marriage of true minds. This is alluding to the words of the marriage service itself. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these 2 persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace, that sort of thing. So our conceit here is, begins with marriage. And this poem is frequently used at weddings. Okay, so. Oi, oi, oi. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Love is not true love that changes when it comes across problems, or abandons the loved one when they are unfaithful or when they have died, or when time, the great remover, has removed them from the earth. This is very much about unconditional love here. The next quatrain turns to a nautical navigation theme, because that's fun. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark. That refers to an unmoving sea mark, such as a lighthouse or a beacon. So he's saying love provides steady support and a constant reference point that looks on tempests. And is never shaken. That's beautiful, right? That's beautiful. It is the star to every wandering bark whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. The star's great intrinsic value cannot be measured, even though sailors can measure their way against the star and not get lost. This is more on love being constant, and that it helps you navigate the rest of your life. It's a mystery, but even though it's mysterious, it helps to explain the rest of your reason for being, which I think is, a beautifully done comparison. Okay, Quatrain 3 is about its immunity to time. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love is immune to time. It does not grow old, even though those in love grow older, and they come within reach of death's scythe or sickle. The compass here obviously relates back to the previous quatrain's navigational thing too. It's a little duality there. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. But holds on, love holds on all the way to the end. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, no man ever loved. Here we have another example of two lines that used to rhyme. And the poet is saying, if I'm proved wrong in this, then I've never written anything, and no man has ever truly loved. So we have a sonnet that says, love is loyal, love is constant, love is ageless. If I'm wrong, then I don't want to be right. That's so nice. So you could see why this might be a great one for a wedding. But do you personally disagree with the poet here? Do you think this is an accurate, fair description of love? That's up to everyone's individual interpretation, because he's not around to tell us anymore. Okay, moving on. Now this, Sonnet 128, is the second sonnet in the Dark Lady sequence, and it's one of my two favorite sonnets, which is why it's here. It's not necessarily one of the most popular sonnets. Nobody else would have you study it, I think, but I love it, so here we are. It's charming, it's romantic, it's relatable. It's also very well done thematically, and it's a great example of a conceit, which is one of our vocab words that we've already been talking about a whole bunch. Yay! Other sonneteers use conceits as expressions of their desire for closer intimacy with the beloved, and they would do that through saying, I wish to be the glove on her hand, a handkerchief in her pocket, a glass that she drinks from, a lapdog, the waves of the ocean on her bare feet, the stirrup she puts her foot into. Oh, any odd thing that you could devise that would bring you closer to your beloved in a conceit. One really weird guy wrote that he wished to be the wine his mistress drank, and to make his way through her body and out her pleasure part, which is not poetic, it's just weird, my opinion. But Shakespeare's attempt here at comparing an activity that isn't generally very sensual to the intimacy between lovers goes much better, I think, than that. He displays jealousy towards the way his beloved holds and plays her harpsichord, an instrument similar to a piano. So I guess holds is the wrong term, but caresses, touches her harpsichord. So, how oft when thou my music playest. The poet here refers to the object of his affection as his music. You're like music to me. You're my music. Music to my ears. All that jazz. Upon that blessed wood whose motion means mechanism here. Upon that blessed wood whose motion sounds with thy sweet fingers when thou gently swayest. Swayest means direct. When thou gently directs. The wiry concord that mine ear confounds. The wiry concord that my ear confounds, that amazes, delights my ears. So, when my love plays her music so beautifully and with such mastery, do I envy those jacks that nimble leap. Jacks refer to the jacks of a keyboard when she plays, but the play on words implies that they're also bold jacks or men who might court her. And leap is often used in a very sexually suggestive way. So, thus the instrument here is compared to another lover who dares to kiss the tender inward of thy hand, whilst my poor lips, which should that harvest reap, while my poor lips that should be the one kissing your fingertips, At the wood's boldness by thee blushing stand. Although the subject is ostensibly my poor lips, it clearly is the poet himself who stands jealously by the harpsichord while she plays, and his lips are flushed with envy and desire. To be so tickled they would change their state and situation with those dancing chips. Dancing chips again refers to the jacks. If it means being so touched or so tickled by your fingers, I would gladly change my shape and become those keys instead of me. O'er whom thy fingers walk with gentle gait, making dead wood more blessed than living lips. Those keys are luckier than I am. Since saucy jacks so happy are in this, since your fingers are good enough for them, they can have them. Give them thy fingers, me thy lips to kiss. And here's our volta right here in the last couplet, where the outlook changes. Oh, I love this piece. That was pretty good, right? I hope. Okay. Now this is my other favorite sonnet, for many reasons. I encourage you again to pause and listen to the recording of Stephen Fry reading this. There are actually many great versions of people reading this sonnet, including the immaculate Alan Rickman, a.k.a. Severus Snape. But Stephen Fry is great with the cadence here, I think, and does a really good job for our purposes. So, for some background on this particular sonnet, I know it just sounds like an insult all the way until our volta at the end. But what Shakespeare is actually doing is subverting a popular theme in poetry at the time called a blazon. With a blazon, a poet compares one's beloved to all things beautiful under the sun and to things divine and immortal, and it was very, very popular at the time to do this. They would use lofty comparisons to praise a beloved idol, put a woman, up on a pedestal. So it's a little bit like our conceit examples, but here instead of wishing to be a glove on someone's hand, you talk about how they are like something fantastical. So an example from Petrarch was, the way she walked was not the way of mortals, but of angelic forms, and when she spoke, more than an earthy voice it was that sang. Comparing her to a goddess. And another by Bartholomew Griffin. My lady's hair is threads of beaten gold, her front the purest crystal eye hath seen, her eyes the brightest stars the heavens hold, her cheeks red roses such as seld have seen, her pretty lips of red vermilion dye, her hand of ivory the purest white, her blush aurora or the morning sky, her breast displays two silver fountains bright, blah, 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 blah. So now, in comparison, this sonnet we have here is a mock of a blazon, or of that method of comparison, an inverted blazon, if you will. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. At first it seemed, again, very much like he's mocking this woman, but in reality it's almost more beautiful by the end. She is not these things, she is herself, and in that she is far more lovely than I could describe by misinterpreting her to be something that she isn't. A few clarifying notes here. If hairs be wires, Elizabethan poets often compared women's hair to golden wires. Damask means decorated or painted. And I never saw a goddess go. Go means walk or leave, as you might have already figured out from context clues. Now I encourage you, if you haven't already, to read this sonnet aloud to yourself. Take a moment to pause the video here if you need to. Notice again where the volta is at the end. I was gonna have you guess, but I already spilled the beans. So, yeah. Anyway, it's marked with an end yet, as we talked about. Sonnet 138. So you can see here that the subject matter has gotten much darker since the beginning of the sonnet sequence. We went from, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more fair and more temperate, to, I know she's a liar. This is our last sonnet, and I wanted us to end on this one to show the drastic change in subject matter from the first half of the sonnets to the second. The young man is described, like we talked about, in these high, beautiful, perfect terms. This ideal love, this mental love, that transcends the physical, the base, lower type of affection, of lust. And yet, even, and that's even when he fails to meet the narrator's standards. And yet, with the Dark Lady, the narrator seems to know that she'll never be better than what she is, though he continues to accept her. Although accept is, obviously kind of a loose term. He feels like he's under her thrall rather than choosing to continue to love her or see the best in her. Even in the last sonnet we read, he approaches her beauty very realistically and refuses to exaggerate, where he might have perhaps done that with the fair youth. So yeah, it's a much more carnal description too, which we saw a bit of in the sonnet about playing music. That was quite lustful, but playful. So then again, here we have the constant use of lie, meaning both being untrue but also being unfaithful, as in, to lie with somebody else in bed, to sleep with somebody else. So, thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young. We're starting here with the second quatrain. Thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although she knows my days are past the best. Simply I credit, foolishly I believe, her false speaking tongue. On both sides thus is simple truth suppressed. So we're both lying. But wherefore means why, says she not she is unjust. Unjust as in unfaithful to the truth, perhaps to him. So why doesn't she just say that she's lying? And wherefore say not I that I am old? And by lying also, again, unfaithful. And why don't I just say that I'm old? Why don't we both just admit the truth? Oh, love's best habit is in seeming trust. Love is best dressed in apparent fidelity, even if it's not true. Seeming could have a dirty implication. Kind of sounds like a little bit of a dirty word. And it was used a lot to indicate something that appears a certain way, even if it wasn't that way. Something it's kind of like today, what does it seem like? When we say that, it doesn't, it means it appears that way. You can say it seems so without it meaning necessarily that it is so. An age in love loves not to have years told. And older people in love don't want to have their age pointed out. I don't think anybody wants their age pointed out, but especially in love, right? Therefore I lie with her, and she with me. Pun on lying again and sleeping with each other. And in our faults, by lies we flattered thee. Our faults are that we lie, and we are flattered by our lies, so we're flattered by our faults. Compare this sonnet to let not the marriage of true minds admit impediment. This is obviously a very drastic change from that ideal love, again, which I feel like I'm pounding on that idea. But basically, you're probably not going to read this one at a wedding. Okay, so, on that note about infidelity and pessimism, the lecture's over. I like to try to end on a really nice positive note. Let me know if you have even the slightest question about any of this, and don't forget to pick a sonnet you like that we didn't cover and submit it to the discussion board. That's it for now, folks. Oh my gosh, I lied. We're not done because I completely forgot to hit the button and show my awesome little comic at the end, so I had to add it in. Okay, now you can go.